Welcome to Overcaffeinated and Out of Effs, the podcast for burned out, career-minded moms who are ready to stop pretending everything's fine and feel like themselves again. I'm your host, Christy Amir, burnout coach for moms, licensed therapist, and mom of two. And I'm here to help you reclaim your energy, your identity, and your peace of mind. Whether you're lying awake thinking about the 87 things you didn't get done, or silently resenting the people you love most, this is your space to feel seen, supported, and not so alone. So grab your coffee, hot, cold, or day old, and let's get into it. Hey everybody, it's Christy. Welcome to Overcaffeinated and Out of Effs. In today's episode, I'd like to welcome our guest, Sarah Wimberley. Sarah drinks her coffee ice cold and black. At first, it was by necessity to not taste what was once a hot cup of coffee. Now it's iced coffee year-round, even with these frigid Philadelphia winters. As a working mom of three, Sarah's plate is always full with board service, volunteering, and a never-ending to-do list. In the last 3 years, though, she made an intentional shift after an anticipated promotion didn't happen, resulting in a dumpster fire of life. Looking back, that dumpster fire was exactly what she needed to reset. What started as a consultancy at a new organization has turned into her overcoming her fears about public speaking, becoming physically and mentally stronger, and acknowledging the value she brings to every conversation and table. So I've invited Sarah here today. She's going to share a bit about her own personal story as a working mom of three, the burnout that she experienced when she was working towards that promotion in a demanding job, and how things really shifted for her when she didn't get it. So Sarah, thank you so much for being here today.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, can you maybe just start off by telling us a little bit more about yourself, maybe a bit about your work, your family, and the season of motherhood you are in right now?
Sure. So Sarah, I am based in Philadelphia. I am a mom of three. And my oldest is in middle school. My middle child is in elementary school, and I have a preschooler as well. So I really appreciate the phrase season of motherhood, because that's one big life lesson I've learned is everything is a season. And so calling it that is pretty appropriate.
Yes, and I feel like things absolutely change for us a lot, like through those seasons, right? Especially once, we do have kids, our lives are just completely, I don't want to say turned upside down, but they're the big shift that really happens with all of us, even when we want to continue to move forward with, a lot of the things that we were doing before. It's just the way that we look at them and the way that we approach them is, it's obviously very different.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the beginning then, because I really want to hear about your story, and how you got to where you are now. So you mentioned that, you've told me before that you weren't really even sure that you wanted to be a mom at first. So do you mind just talking a little bit more about that? Like, what were your fears and your hesitations around that?
So I guess looking back, in the moment, I think it was more a perfectionist approach. We were also very paycheck to paycheck people. I mean, we still are in a big way, but not as much, thankfully, now. But my husband and I both work full time, and I did a lot of freelancing on the side to make up the gap so that we could move away from being as paycheck to paycheck. But kids are expensive, and Philadelphia has a moderate cost of living. Thankfully, it's not as expensive to live here, say, as New York City, but it's still not cheap. We used to live in the South, and it's, more expensive than that for sure. So we knew going in, there would be daycare costs and diapers and, a lot of associated costs. And having a kid was more than just the kid itself. So it was more of a financial fear that we would go and do this big, great thing, and it would be lovely, and we would, embrace that part and that new chapter. But then we would be more broke than we already were. So in some ways it was maybe an over logical, I was absolutely overthinking it. It was an over logical kind of thought process, which I still very much do. But it was kind of I absolutely was overthinking it in a lot of ways, and really wanted it to be perfect and didn't want to make a mistake. And it wasn't till maybe I was in my late 20s. I was actually 29 when my oldest was born. So I, was kind of at the point where if we were going to have kids, we needed to have kids, kind of have that, um, start that process and,
Mhm.
make the choice now, because we absolutely did not want to be, on Medicare and our kids going to college at the same time. We wanted to be able to enjoy being parents and travel with our kids and then enjoy retirement in the same time. So, it was kind of it was a no go decision at that point. And thankfully it has all worked out. So
Well, and honestly, like, as I'm listening to you talk, so it sounds like, kids were maybe something that you wanted all along, but the big hesitation was financial, which, it makes me kind of sad because unfortunately, I do think that that is a reality for so many people today. I mean, I know you said you felt like you were overthinking it, but I mean, it is expensive to have kids. And, I do think that it's an important thing for people to sort of be thinking about with their planning. It does make me sad to hear that for a while you thought maybe didn't even wanna have kids because of that reason when it sounds like a big part of you did wanna have kids. But I'm curious, what despite that fear, like, what ultimately changed your mind?
I really honestly think it was a situation where, to your point, like it was kind of always something that I wanted. I always wanted to have a big family. My dad is one of 5 kids and my mom has 2 brothers. So, as a kid, I being the oldest grandchild, I was always kind of responsible in a way for like wrangling all my cousins at holidays and things. So, a loud, big house full of kids was kind of always what I was used to. So, I definitely wasn't against having kids. But both my husband and I were kind of 50-50, and we always kind of was like, well, okay, well, if it happens, it happens. But we weren't, kind of, it wasn't top of the list. We also had made other caregiving choices in our 20s, even as newlyweds, to support other family members, whether they were living with us or we were living with them. And so, having kids was kind of on the back burner for a fair bit because we just had other family priorities at the, earlier in our marriage. So,
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and to your point, I mean, when you're a bit younger and when maybe you're earlier on, maybe you sort of have different priorities, and then as life goes on, maybe things shift and change, and it sounds like, some of that maybe happened for you over, throughout your 20s.
mhm.
Um, okay, so when your first child was born, so you said that you were 29 at the time. So I imagine fully into your career at that point. I'm curious, like what surprised you most about motherhood, especially as a working mom?
Yeah, so when my oldest was born, I was in the professional space for 7, 8 years at that point post college. But I was maybe 2 years into kind of a real job, I guess, that was more of a career type job. Definitely a more of a long-term outlook that I had at that organization and that role. I had a 401k and, all those kind of happy perks and healthcare insurance. Um, but I think the piece that was maybe the most compounded, maybe the stress of being a new working mom was how kind of unsupportive the institution that I was working for really was.
Mm.
On paper, they did the right things. They had the short-term disability and they had the FMLA and my peers were really supportive and even, during 2 of my 3 children, my first and last kids, my direct manager was very supportive. But the bigger institution, having to jump through way too many hoops and have way too many conversations about, kind of fighting for 12 weeks of FMLA, that was that should not have been that hard. And then even returning back to work, getting a privacy room to pump at work should not have needed to be
Yeah.
as big of a thing as it was, and get approvals from multiple bosses, and, it's already awkward enough maybe to some degree, um, and it's not necessarily something that should be needed to be broadcasted in that way, but, their process was, 15 people needed to
Mhm.
approve my 15-minute breaks to go do that, and, yeah, just broadly was kind of, compounded a lot of the stress, of not sleeping and being away for, 12 hours, working and commuting and all that. that definitely did not help. And that was definitely, looking back, probably the biggest surprise, because in a lot of ways, I feel like, we're women are pushed to have it all in a lot of ways. And in some, and myself too, like I really wanted to have it all. Like I wanted to have the career and I
Uh-huh.
wanted to have the family and I, wanted to check all the boxes. But in a lot of ways, just like seasons of motherhood, there's seasons for that too. And that was a tough lesson for me to learn, that I couldn't
Uh-huh.
have it all at the same time. And
Uh-huh.
um that you go through the different phases and kind of negotiate those periods of change. And when my first was born, it was really kind of learning to advocate for myself in a lot of ways, that um and kind of maybe fighting in a loose way, but like asking for what I wanted and maybe choosing not to back down in a
Uh-huh.
and especially with my middle child. They my FMLA crossed over New Year's,
Uh-huh.
and the fact that it crossed over into the new calendar year, um, despite planning, despite communication, um, leadership at my job at the time was wanted me to come back like right after New Year's, and
Mm.
I pushed back and I said, no, like this is my 12-week FMLA.
Yeah.
This is what was approved. I'm coming back, whatever, the third week of January, whatever it was. And if that's not acceptable, then just please let me know. And um and I was willing to walk away from my job at that point because it was
Yeah.
incredibly stressful. The support wasn't there. And honestly, like I knew I had enough transferable skills and enough experience in doing what I was doing, that I really was not concerned about getting a new job at that point. And the priority was, my newborn and my family. And um, my husband was working full time. And so it would have been tough. We would have definitely gone back to the
Mhm.
paycheck. But, that's the hill I was willing to die on at the point. And thankfully it didn't come to pass. And, I got my 12 weeks. But
Uh-huh.
those little kind of um, uh, like speed bumps are definitely exacerbate a lot of the challenges when you're trying to balance motherhood and working at the same time.
Yeah, no, and I think one of the things about motherhood is I think a lot of people sort of have this idea of, especially working motherhood, is a lot of people have this idea of what that's gonna look like, what that's gonna be like. You sort of hear
Mhm.
some stories and just sort of, have this picture in your mind. And I think a lot of times there are challenges that we have to deal with that we don't anticipate, that we don't expect to be coming. We know that it's gonna be hard, but when we're actually in the reality of it, like you said, your company was doing all the right things on paper, but they were making you jump through all these hoops. It was
Mhm.
adding all this stress. And that I imagine is maybe something that you weren't necessarily anticipating, like when you were planning and whatnot.
Oh, of course.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I'm glad that you felt, comfortable, like you felt, if you did have to give up your job, if you had to leave it, that was something that you felt prepared to do. And so you felt more comfortable, sort of letting go of the people pleasing and not worrying so much about what they thought. It sounds like you were still very assertive and professional, but, you were speaking up for what you need, and unfortunately, I think that's a barrier for a lot of people is this idea of, well, one, this desire to please others, but also this fear of what will happen if I do push back
Mhm.
because maybe I can't afford to lose my job or whatever it might be. So yeah, that can be a tricky situation.
It can.
So,
Not a
oh,
good
well,
situation either, to be feeling like you're almost having to be defensive and during a point where you should be happy and excited and, despite the sleep deprivation, you know,
yeah.
like a new chapter in your life, and then there's people around you that are making it harder than it needs.
Yeah. As if having a new baby isn't stressful enough. Like, you don't need, like,
I know.
these
Yeah.
added things piled on, exactly. Alright, so let's fast forward then to, 2024, because you had mentioned that that was a time in your life where really you were experiencing the burnout. That's when you were really sort of in it. By that point, you had 3 kids, you were still working at your job. I'm curious, how were you affected at that point by burnout? Like, how did you experience that physically, mentally, emotionally?
Yeah, I guess honestly at the time, I don't know that I really equated to what was happening to me to as burnout. It wasn't until I actually left and took a new job. that was much slower paced, much just a very different environment, that then I realized how bad it really was for me. Um, and before I made that pivot, I wasn't sleeping. I was exhausted. I was like walking exhausted constantly. But I was maybe sleeping 3 or 4 hours a night, and it was very uninterrupted because I had a 3-year-old at the time. So, um, that in and of itself was a challenge, right? What little sleep I got was not really quality sleep. Uh,
Mhm.
I didn't have time to work out, so I had no like outlet to get out any kind of anxiety or energy in that way. Um, I was not in a role or professional environment where I could speak freely or have any kind of um, psychological trust in with my own leadership. I had peers and colleagues that thankfully were really really supportive, and places that I could vent and could commiserate with me in a lot of ways, because they knew the people and could kind of talk me off a lot of ledges, walk me through those kind of conversations before they happened, and let me practice all my kind of my defensiveness without being so tenacious. But I really honestly didn't at the time equate it to burnout, and I think
Mhm.
that is maybe the toughest thing, because it it really escalates to the point where you are beyond burned out,
Right.
and at home, that meant I was coming home from work. The mornings were okay. I mean, it was rushed, you're getting everybody out the door, but I was coming home from work and I was just done. I spent
Mhm.
all of my emotional, mental energy keeping myself together at work and trying to get through meetings and conversations and tasks at work, that I really had nothing left for my family. And um, that that wasn't good. And I knew that was happening. I could see that happening, and um, that really was exacerbated by me kind of chasing this promotion in a way. Um, that then at the time when it didn't happen, it was really it was embarrassing, and it was dehumanizing, and it was
Mhm.
it was absolutely a dumpster fire. But at the same time, and you mentioned it earlier, it was kind of the best thing that happened, to be totally honest. 'Cause it pushed me to look elsewhere, and to move on, and have a much better work life now.
Well, and you talked about how at first when you were experiencing all of this, you didn't even like recognize it as burnout. And I think that that is another thing that is really, really common for so many moms.
Mhm.
And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. And so for you, so you were in a situation where you were already burned out. You didn't necessarily recognize it at the time. You did notice, that it was affecting you at home, in your relationships with your kids and your husband. And then you had this promotion coming up, right? That you were in line for, um, and you were pushing yourself for that. It was a
Mhm.
job that at the time you thought you did want. And looking back, I'm curious, like what, even with all this going on, even though you were maybe already past your limits, what was it about that job that felt enticing for you? Like, why? What did it represent to you? Like, why did you feel that push to go for it? Do you think?
I think it was there was a couple pieces I think at play. I mean, but it would have been a pay raise, which definitely gives would have given my family a lot more latitude. Um, and that that was would have been a big perk. But I think in a lot of ways, it definitely fell back on the people pleasing bit. I think a fair bit, um, to be able to have someone as young as I was attain that level in the organization was kind of unheard of. And especially in the division I was in, rarely people got promoted from within, and I was. Throughout my career in the organization, usually, outsiders were kind of brought in at the level that I was aiming for. So it was in a lot of ways, trying to prove myself, trying to be accepted into like that kind of inner circle in a way. The pay raise wouldn't have hurt it either, but
Mhm.
it, there was definitely a couple factors. But um, it's in the long run, you know, it was absolutely infuriating in the moment. But funnily enough, kind of the same day that I had a very difficult conversation, I got the call from the recruiter for the job that I ended up leaving for. So it was a roller coaster of a day, but it was, ended up being kind of the big transition point for me, which um, really made me realize, I think, in a lot of ways that acceptance of, I guess, the perception of acceptance means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and
Mhm.
was more important for me to be confident in myself and for me to accept myself for what I could do and the value that I knew I could deliver, regardless of, what my boss thought about me or what their boss thought about me or whatever my title was. And that season of my life, I needed to start putting my kids first. And being in meetings 10 hours a day and gone out of the house 13 hours a day wasn't wasn't good for anybody. And I wasn't, I know as working moms, everybody else is at top of the to-do list, and
Mhm.
we rarely make time for ourselves. And I really needed to put myself out on the list, on the list,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
to put myself at the top, which felt really selfish, to be totally honest, because that in and of itself was something very new for me. But that's, it was what I needed to do. And
Yeah. No, and I think that again, I think that that is something that a lot of us struggle with. There are more and more conversations about this idea of it's okay to take care of yourself. Not only is it okay, but it's important, it's necessary. But for a lot of people, it does feel selfish because it's contradicting something that they've essentially believed for so long. So,
yeah,
um,
absolutely. It definitely challenges kind of like the mental models um, that that society puts on working moms and women broadly, but definitely working moms, working parents in general. And I think for myself, it was kind of risk management as well, because I didn't want to take PTO for myself because, as soon as I would take the PTO, then a kid would get sick.
yeah.
And inevitably, if I told anyone I was taking the day off or an afternoon off, like, then a kid would explode and I would need to my PTO would not be for me anymore, it would be to cover a kid. And that still honestly still happens. 2 out of 3 times it gets kibosh. But, I take the PTO now and I admittedly don't tell anybody. I
Mhm.
just block my time and I quietly hang out or I, do, I don't know, go get a massage or do something myself. Um, but I feel like it's a grace we need to give ourselves more than I think
Mhm.
working moms do today. And in a way, I guess if I maybe looking back, I think maybe if I'd started it from the beginning as a parent, maybe it would have turned out differently. I think my personality of being very goal oriented and driven and a competitive person, I don't know that it would have necessarily changed.
Mhm.
Me becoming ultimately burned out. Maybe it would have taken longer because I would have had breaks and things along the way, but it still probably would have happened. But now I
Well,
take that time and I'm a lot more intentional about it.
Well, and I think one of the things that's important to mention too is that, what you're describing, it sounds like when you say it might have happened either way, I'm wondering if really what would have been more likely to happen is that you might have experienced, more temporary stress, right? Because we're all going to experience stress. That's going to be something that is true for everybody. Moms who are working, moms who aren't working, people who are not moms, stress is part of life. But once it becomes chronic and it's unresolved, eventually that's when it starts to cross that line into burnout. And
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
so, okay, so one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, so going back to this promotion, you talked about how it's a very emotional roller coaster of a day because you thought you were going to get the promotion, you wanted the promotion, your boss's buddy got the promotion. So that brought up a lot of feelings. And then you said that you got uh, the recruiter reached out to you that same day. And so there was a lot that was happening at that time. Um, and I'm curious, you were also talking about how it really sort of affected your confidence. So even though this new opportunity, was right there, it sounds like you were still carrying a lot of feelings. There was still a pretty big effect on your identity, your feelings
Mhm.
of confidence and self-worth for a period of time after.
Oh, yeah.
Can you say, like, a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think any, I guess, blow like that can rock you in different ways, and I think given how much time and mental and emotional energy I was spending at work, I mean, my professional career was easily 80-90% of my identity. Um, 90% of my friends were at work. So a lot of my life, and goals and accomplishments were wrapped up in my professional career at that point. Um, I have worn a lot of hats, over my post college life in the last 20 years. And at that point, couple, 2 years ago, um, I'd stepped away from, being a professional photographer and doing freelance work, and I was volunteering, but wasn't as much at that point. And, a lot of my waking hours were spent at work. So to go through, 5-6 months of, kind of overdoing it and, trying to prove myself just to have, hear through the grapevine and, have it ultimately confirmed that I wasn't good enough was a huge blow. To really realize that really maybe no matter what I could do, what I was doing, was never going to be good enough, and no matter how I conducted myself at work, how much I tried to shrink and mask my own personality to fit what was expected of me, whether it was my bosses or the organization, was not gonna cut it. And that is, I mean, when you're not allowed to be, when you don't feel like you can be yourself at work, is one thing. But then when you invest all of that time and energy just to kind of have it come back and be like, thanks, but no thanks.
Mhm.
It it's embarrassing. It's in a way, I definitely felt like I I learned a lot. Now I can say I learned a lot. And
Mhm.
I was able to accomplish a lot of things that my predecessor couldn't, because they didn't know the team members as well. They didn't know what we did from a day-to-day perspective as well. So I was able to accomplish a lot in the time that I assumed that role. But at the same time, um, kind of going through that process is absolutely kind of takes the bottom out of you, because so much, I think, of what we do as working moms is wrapped up in our professional career. And we're on the back burner as individuals. So
Yeah. Well,
when
so
peace just kind of cuts away, it's everything.
well, okay, so I'm curious then. So how did you start to rebuild your confidence then after, being overlooked professionally in that way when so much of your identity was tied into your role at work?
It was really difficult. I guess it absolutely helped being approached for a consultancy position at a new organization. Admittedly, it wasn't a job that I had applied for. Recruiter found me on LinkedIn, so that was a surprise and kind of rewarding in and of itself. But when you get those kinds of like cold emails and cold calls about, jobs that may or may not exist, it's, you kind of take it with a grain of salt in a lot of ways. But um, that was a little bit of a boost, but you have to start small. And I really
Mhm.
tried to focus on being present where I could, and started to use my commute as like a kind of a reset, between home and work life.
Oh, I used to do that too.
So I would, listen to podcasts, listen to books, while I was taking the bus or driving, and um, tried really hard to set boundaries on like work meetings during that period of time. And really kind of push back as best I could that, if you really need me in this meeting, you need to shift it, and or I would delegate it and catch up later, which was not easy because that whole
Sure.
people pleasing thing. Um, but it was something that I really needed to kinda set guardrails for myself, because the fact that the promotion didn't pan out, I'm it's very, disincentivizing to continue to go kind of above and beyond when.
Well, it sounds like it was almost, in a lot of ways, it was a blessing in disguise, not only because, it gave you an opportunity to sort of step back and try new things and live your life a different way, but it sounds like because you weren't as concerned, you talked about being disincentivized, it sounds like setting those boundaries, for example, saying, hey, this meeting time, I can't do it. It sounds like because the risk felt a little bit lower, you were maybe more comfortable doing these things that, quite frankly, were probably important in your own, emotional and mental health, protecting that
Mhm.
anyways. It just
Yeah.
maybe felt a little bit easier.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was easier after that period of time. But again, it's one more thing that maybe, you know, if I had started setting and maintained those real reasonable boundaries, and kind of kept established, work hours and didn't respond to IMs and messages in the evenings and kind of have better, um, I mean, it was definitely still an imbalance, but had those guardrails up for myself. Um, and I think that would have definitely helped. It's never going to solve all of the problems, but
Right.
um, I
Well,
think
and we're
all those little things kind of start to add up in a way.
Well, yeah, and we're not looking to solve all the problems, right? Because that wouldn't be realistic. But it's really about, making changes, that
Mhm.
support ourselves, support our families, support our lives in a way that does prioritize our mental and emotional and physical well-being and really sort of protects ourselves. And that's just something that can really be difficult. And
Mhm.
so I'm curious, we were talking earlier about how, the burnout sort of snuck up on you. You didn't realize it was happening. It was creating these problems at home with your relationships and whatnot, with your kids, with your husband. Once you made that change in your job, in your career, how did things start shifting for you in other areas of your life?
It definitely was a pretty immediate shift with, I guess, the work-life balance in a big way. Um, my new role, just by nature of onboarding into a new organization, went from a million miles an hour to, a school zone essentially, um, which was really disorienting, to be totally honest. And I used a lot of that extra time to, I guess, figure out what I wanted to do. If this role that I had just accepted was something that could be long term, what professional development goals I had, whether it was a formal certification or just coursework or something like that. It also gave me the latitude, because I was able to kind of, build my own schedule to some degree, being a consultant in the beginning. I was able to, go get back to playing soccer and, being able to set aside that time and protect that time in a way that I wasn't able to before, when I needed to be in the office on set days. And, I guess all of those little things, um, definitely helped. Um,
Mhm.
and I think maybe and getting started in that was probably the hardest part, because and for me, I was so used to go, 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 like running
Mhm.
an hour, and then to essentially, working remotely, not having a commute anymore. Um, I I got, a lot of house projects accomplished. We were caught up on laundry for the first time in like forever, which was great. But then at the same time, in a big way, I lost a lot of my identity as a professional, because my kind of social circle was really completely gone. So, but I got that back through, kind of reconnecting with soccer and being a lot more intentional with, volunteering and board service and things like that. And, it's, not quite the same, but, still working and kind of, um, continuing to kind of like build that back up a little bit. But thankfully, even now, a few years into my new chapter, still able to keep that work-life balance, in a really good way. And,
Mhm.
there's always crazy days and busy days and things, but, it's thankfully not nearly um, as much of a dumpster fire as it was before. But I know what I need now, like, I know I
Yeah.
set those boundaries early on, And I also know that I need to be communicative when it's not something that works for me, or when I do have a preference and someone asks what some of my preferences, actually
Mhm.
answer and say and be truthful and honest. And um, it's kind of it's absolutely a double edged sword,
Yeah.
uh, because the organization I'm working for now is a lot more um, is just it's a different organization, and it has a very different mindset and collaborative spirit than my prior role. So that, in conjunction with now me knowing where my boundaries are and where I need to kind of set the stage and set expectations for myself and my team members now, the organization is a lot more supportive and collaborative as well. So no matter, to some degree, no matter maybe what I would have done in my last organization, it might not have ever worked because the environment wasn't really built that way.
Yeah, no, and I think that a lot of times, you're talking about a situation where you were sort of forced into this change and it ended up in the long run really working out for you. And I think that there are a lot of people who maybe know that they're not in the best situation and they sort of question this idea of change and if it would be good for them. But a lot of times they don't follow through with things like that because once change is scary, right? Because you don't necessarily know what you're walking into. What if things feel worse or harder or whatever? They don't always think about the fact that it could also be, a lot better. But also, this idea, this fear of what is going to be lost, or what could be lost. You talked about losing your identity, losing your social circles, all of these sorts of things. But one of the things that I really love that you talked about and touched on is that over time you were able to rebuild things. And we don't always think about that or we don't always see it at the time, again, because it's in the future, it's down the road. But I think that it's important to just sort of put out that reminder that we can rebuild these things
Yeah,
and then
absolutely.
ultimately find ourselves in a much better situation than we were before.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess maybe the one good piece of advice I got from my boss at my last organization, was that I needed to do a better job networking. And
Hmm.
that made me, pushing myself to do that even when I was burned out, did give me some kind of relief from the endless meetings, having like walking meetings with people or, connecting with people, even if it was, we talk about, work projects and things like that. But then we also have things in common and, we have kids that are the same age or both have interests in the same sports or whatever it might be. So that definitely helped in a lot of ways. And but that taking that smidge piece of advice now into my new chapter, I'm from the get-go, from day one, I've been pushing myself to network, and now a few years in, those kind of sidebar checkpoints I've built along the way, have been really instrumental in kind of rebuilding that social network. Um, and even through the public speaking bit that I've started to kind of do in the last maybe 13 months or so, like there's a whole little community there too that has been great. And I don't live anywhere near these people. People come from all over the states and the world to different conferences that I'm at as well. But um, you know, you connect with these people over maybe one little interaction, and it can really be kind of a lifeline in a way, or at least a new kind of point of collaboration or engagement for you that's a little bit out of your comfort zone, but then also just continues to rebuild those connections so that you don't feel as isolated or as disconnected.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And networking, I mean, in terms of, you were talking about socially, but also with your public speaking, professionally, building those relationships can be so helpful for so many different reasons. And I do think that that's one of the positive shifts after COVID. Obviously, COVID threw a wrench in a lot of people's lives and created a lot of, challenges there. But I think one of the good things is that it did sort of open up this new world of connection through computers using technology so that we are able to reach further with those efforts. So with that in mind though, you're talking about networking, you're talking about being able to connect with people. So for people who are listening, who maybe want to connect with you or they want to learn more about you, any of the work that you do, public speaking that you do, any of those kinds of things, where can they go to do that?
So I am on LinkedIn, and Insta and Facebook. But I do also have a website, ulster-tech.com. And I usually keep it pretty up to date with all my speaking engagements and that sort of thing, along with links to my different talks. So there's definitely information there, but welcome anybody to connect with me on LinkedIn or other social media platforms. And
Okay, that sounds great. And so I will, of course, make sure that all that information is available in the show notes for anybody who does want to reach out to you and connect with you and look you up. Um, okay, so before we wrap up for today, just one final question. I always like to ask everybody this. If you could leave the listeners with one final message, one final piece of advice, what would it be?
I would suggest to all the working moms out there to do the scary thing. Take whatever that little step is that's going to push you to set aside time for yourself every day, set that boundary, update your resume, apply to the job. Um, it does feel daunting and it is absolutely scary, but just do it. Go for it.
Do the scary thing. I love that. Okay, thank you so much. So, and again, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing your story. I think that this is, such a relatable story. I think it's going to be so valuable to people who are listening to it or who are especially those struggling with, similar things and similar challenges, or maybe this idea of, do I want to change, the direction that I'm going? I really do appreciate, your time and your openness with that. And then as always for the moms who are listening, if any of this resonates, if you found these things that we talked about today to be valuable, to be helpful, look up Sarah, you find, you can connect with her. And also please share this podcast with any other moms that could maybe use some additional support because we're all in this together.